Wow, look at that beautiful sunset. You know, it kind of reminds me of a poem I just read called The Wild Swans at Cool. A beautiful October twilight. And yet, it wasn't really about the twilight or the October. In fact, it symbolized something much deeper. Today we're going to be talking about William Butler Yeats. Now, you've already heard a little bit about Yeats' life from Roberto, and now I'm going to discuss his influences and experiences, the literary and historic movements that influenced him, the key elements to his style and poetry, and our and many other people's opinions on William Butler Yeats. First off, let's talk about Yeats' experiences and influences. Now, Yeats was most heavily influenced by his Irish culture, especially by the idea of Irish independence and by Irish mythology. He was also very interested in nature and in religion. Many of his pre-1900s works were based on the glory and beauty of Ireland, especially as its own country. Also, he was inspired by poets like Blake and Shelley, but he didn't copy their exact style. In his earlier years, Yeats was interested in the occult, but most of that influence went into essays like The Vision. Now, later in his life, Yeats became particularly interested in his old age. He often wrote poems about the difference between youth and between old age, as shown in Sailing to Byzantium. Now, to completely understand Yeats, you need to know a little bit about Irish history. In the early 1900s, Ireland revolted against Britain in order to become their own independent country. Unfortunately, Yeats never lived to see that. But Yeats was very pro-Irish independence, and he was inspired by such revolts as the Easter Uprising of 1916, for which he wrote poetry. He was also very inspired by the sacrifices of the flesh and the laws of bodily form, but the perpetuation of the soul in the spirit of martyrdom. Also in the early 1900s, he became older, which means that he was more angered and annoyed by the lack of Irish culture appreciation by the younger generations. In such poems like Sailing to Byzantium, we see the contradictions between the young and the old, and his feelings towards wanting to be young again, and yet being angry at the young as well. Now let's hear a little bit of critical reception by another famous Irish author, Sean O'Fallaghan.
Top of the morning, my name is Sean O'Fallaghan, and today we're going to be talking about William Butler Yeats. Now, one interesting thing I noticed about Yeats is the conflict in his life and poetry. I think that Yeats is a paragon of a great Irish citizen. In his works, he struggled with the ideas of realism versus romanticism, body versus soul, and traditionalist versus revolt. Now, Yeats yearned for something deep, yet something spiritual and patriotic. Before the 1900s, he focused his works, like his collection The Wind in the Reeds, around nationalism and pride in tradition. Yet, following the turn of the century, Yeats began to center around his own soul. He was outraged that the new generation could not follow old Ireland. While he yearns for the beauty of the motherland, he also wishes to find beauty within. During his later years, he finds himself writing more and more contradictory statements, yet his style still reflects his beautiful key lyric. Now, as a man of the new Irish generation, I cannot understand his view of a change in Ireland. While he was not respected for the master of words he is, he was truly a man of two different worlds.
Yeats was a lyric poet. He used lots of visual imagery, and his poems often had a song-like tone. He usually incorporated a rhyme scheme into his poems, but a few, like The Second Coming, did not use rhyme. His poetry is heavily symbolic and can be glanced over if not fully analyzed. His experiences and travels around Ireland and his real emotions are all put into his work. During his later years, he developed a more nostalgic style, as he wished to be young again. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what Roberto and I think on Yeats's poetry. We both agree that the poetry is very beautiful, especially in his lyric style, and it's very inspirational because of the passion and the nationalism that Yeats had. We think that he often is elusive in his theme because it's deeply symbolic and often hidden by other aspects of his poetry. Now, personally, I think that his poetry is very centered around corporal and spiritual forms, which I think is very interesting. Now, Roberto thinks that he has a great way of focusing on the major aspects of his time and incorporating them into his work, while at the same time using beautiful poetry style to put the theme together with these historical aspects. Both contemporary and 1900s writers, like John Lucas and Shawn, as we said before, do believe that Yeats is a definite outlier in the world of poetry. But we all agree that he may be one of the best poets of the 19th century.